This episode is brought to you by Suzy, a cutting-edge market research software platform that empowers some of the biggest companies in the world, like Citibank and Procter & Gamble. To find out more about how Suzy can help you stay competitive, go to tearsheet.co/Suzy. Welcome to the Tearsheet Podcast, where we explore financial services together with an eye on technology, innovation, emerging models, and changing expectations. I'm Tearsheet Editor-in-Chief, Zach Miller. Today, we're joined by Joe Heck, CEO of Zip, a leading buy now, pay later company that's evolving payment options for consumers and merchants. Joe brings over 20 years of consumer lending experience and a strong innovation track record to Zip. Before Zip, Joe served as CEO and previously COO of U.S. fintech Happy Money, where he oversaw sales, risk, data science, operations, and customer experience. His financial services expertise was built during his 15-year career at TrueStage, holding leadership roles in sales and product innovation while helping financial institutions with digital transformation. Today, we'll explore Joe's vision for Zip, how he's leveraging partnerships with companies like Stripe, Visa, and retailers, including GameStop, and the opportunities he sees in the evolving U.S. market for alternative payments. Welcome to Tearsheet, Joe.
Hey, thanks, Zach. I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. So you're new in this role. And so I think let's start there. Like, in your transition to Zip comes after leadership roles at Happy Money and TrueStage. Like, what are you bringing from your experiences there into leadership role at Zip? And how do they inform your approach, I guess, to leading the company?
Yeah, no, really good question. And I think, probably best I maybe talk a little bit about my own personal background.
Let's hear it.
I think it bleeds into like why Zip and what's I think exciting about the company. I grew up in a really blue collar kind of paycheck to paycheck background, Flint, Michigan. It's got some grittiness and some underdog mentality to it. And, that was really something that's kind of been part of who I am for a really long time. So when the opportunity came up with Zip and just kind of seeing not only the market position, but probably more importantly, the consumer that we serve, it was really a wonderful match for kind of who I am and what I believe in. And I think there's no shortage of really strong culture here that supports the mission to really help kind of this underestimated consumer base. So it's been an exciting journey. I think I'm, 8 months now. So feel like I can talk reasonably fluently at this point.
So you bring that scrappiness in for this underserved customer base. Can you help us define who that customer is, the target customer?
Sure. Yeah. If you think about kind of the average everyday American, we estimate there's over 100 million in this kind of underestimated population where FICO and traditional financial system really doesn't serve this customer base well. And that's a customer that we have continued to kind of help in this paycheck to paycheck world. I think one of the probably underestimated or maybe misunderstood pieces is these folks really have great ability to pay. They've got some lumpiness in the way their income rolls in, and their expenses don't have quite as much lumpiness. And I think where Zip steps in is we provide access when and where they need it, really helping them with kind of everyday needs. And it's created a really unique relationship that in a unique position for our brand in the market.
That's awesome. And I know the story you guys reported recently, and there's a nice growth story going on at Zip. I'm curious if you can help to uncover that for us and talk about what's driving the growth, where you see that headed in the future.
Yeah. We've had great growth. Lucky to be a part of a really wonderful global team as well. We grew in the U.S. over 40% year over year, and that really was on a couple different fronts. One is we grew our customer base significantly, over 400,000 new customers in the first half of our fiscal year. But we also grew engagement with our existing customers. You think about kind of average transaction, but also frequency. We're seeing a lot strong uptick in both categories for us. I think that engagement, has really been a big part of it in building trust with our consumer base. But I think also like this probably underpins the larger macro story here in the U.S. U.S. is early days in BNPL adoption rates. I think we're at roughly 2% of payments and only 5% of e-com. You contrast that with where Australia's at, which is feels like a little bit of the home of BNPL.
Yeah, exactly.
And where Europe is, they're at 15 to 20% respectively. And it just tells you there's a lot of upside still left in the US, and it's an area that we think we're super well positioned for.
So you're driving both new customer growth and engagement. Can you talk about maybe some of the techniques or tactics that has led you guys to see that type of growth?
Yeah, so from a new product perspective, we really try to build products and services that meet the customer where they're at, wherever that is on their financial journey. And our ability to meet them for everyday expenses around our Pay in 4 product continues to be the core. How we'll expand that, we have a Pay in 8 capability that allows us to handle a little bit larger transaction sizes for our customer base. But really what we believe in at our core is meeting that customer with flexibility. And flexibility can show up in a lot of different ways. It can be really strong approval rates with customers that largely are left out by the traditional FICO system. But it also, I think, is going where the product is going for us, which is what we call Pay in Z. Pay in Z will allow us to match the customer a little bit more specifically. I think of it as personalization at scale. If a customer wants to pay a certain dollar amount, we can flex the term to match that payment date. And there's a lot of additional opportunity there. I think the other way that we engage the customer is we continue to try to make Zip accessible wherever it is that they're at. So that's has to do with our merchant growth strategy, our in-store experience, and largely you can start to see where we're headed with partnerships like GameStop, partnerships like Stripe from a distribution standpoint. So I think we're just scratching the surface on our growth story, but 40% year over year feels really good.
It's absolutely good. I'm kind of curious. You touched on it a little bit in your answer just now, Joe, but at a certain point, maybe from a customer perspective, it may be harder as more entrants in the BNPL space, enter the space and there's more noise around it. Like, how does Zip differentiate itself amongst like you said, maybe early days, but it is a competitive space.
Yeah. I would say maybe taking a half a step back, and I'll probably get on a soapbox a little bit. But when I look at like the traditional financial system, think of credit cards, like the incentive alignment for the consumer is not strong. The banks win when the customer loses. It's a complex product. The average Americans don't want to understand how an APR works and how revolving balances work. I look at where we're at, and we have BNPLs have a really strong incentive alignment with the consumer, and we win when the consumer wins, and we lose when the consumer loses. If they can't pay us back, our model doesn't work either. So I think that incentive alignment is kind of core to why we're seeing stronger and stronger product adoption. I think the other thing is the simplicity of the product is really built on trust with the consumer. And I think that simplicity has created an easier understanding of the product and the payment terms. And consumers, I think, are really picking up on that. And I think the combination of the two is like, basically, look, we're not built in a way that a consumer can drive onto that like endless debt treadmill where they can't get off. These are transactions that pay off over the course of 6 weeks. And if they pay us back, great. If they don't, then their access to credit is dropped. But I think the incentive alignment and simplicity has created this bond of trust that allows us to really differentiate specifically with this underestimated consumer. I think that the average financial system products and services try to flex into eventually kind of pushing these folks into an APR product, where we're just trying to help them in that paycheck to paycheck bridge. The way that plays out for the consumer, I think I've talked quite a bit about, but the way that plays out for the merchant is equally important. Most of these folks, like you think about a Black Friday deal, for example, if that happens to be in between the paycheck to paycheck, a lot of this consumer base misses the moment. We allow the retailer to catch that moment with these consumers. A percentage of our customer base would have had to abandon their cart in those situations and wait for their paycheck to come in. So I think like that incremental lift is something very unique to Zip within our merchant partnerships.
The financial industry depends on data, but not all data is created equal. Choosing partners who can separate fleeting trends from groundbreaking innovations is more crucial than ever. If you want to unearth what forces are shaping the industry right now, download our guide at tearsheet.co/Susie. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about distribution. You mentioned it with your deal with Stripe. I guess I have two questions there. One is, how important are those exclusive relationships with retailers like a GameStop? I assume that's an exclusive one. I have to imagine over time, those get more and more competitive, and I guess there's a race to use those relationships in order to get directly to the end customer and build a relationship with the end customer. So the first part of the question is, how important are those distribution relationships with retailers? And I'm curious also with the Stripes, like, how are those strategic relationships evolving and what you see going on there?
Yeah. Let me break up the two questions. Both are really, really important to how the market's moving around. One is like, I think exclusivity is largely evaporated or eroded across the industry. I think you look at kind of the early days, it felt like a little bit of a winner take all mindset, if you will. I think the retailers have started to really pick up on the best way for me to optimize my checkout is to have multiple BNPLs, multiple payment options, meet the consumers with the payment option that best fits them. I think this is where Zip really excels. The other payment options, other BNPLs don't really fit our customer base. So having us sit next to some of the bigger BNPLs is really fine with us. I think we both have unique strengths, and I think that provides the best overall checkout lift to our merchant partners. So I would say from an exclusivity standpoint, it makes sense here and there, but for the most part, we believe like optionality for the consumer is the best thing. I think that bleeds into this distribution conversation as well. I think, look, every company, I'm sure every company you've interviewed talks about their resource constraints, and everybody wants to drive integration. I think the way we look at some of these distribution partnerships is simplicity for our retail partners. Stripe has connectivity with thousands upon thousands of merchants, and really kind of taking a one-to-many approach with partners that like Stripe from a B2B to B standpoint is really important for our scalability. I think you've seen some of our or the other BNPLs really push on those partnerships. We're in kind of our early days of optimizing those as well. And so when again, kind of coming back to our growth story, I think we've done really, really well. But there's a ton of room left with the execution around our go-to-market.
I hear that. I'm kind of curious, if we double click on the merchant relationships, are there particular subsectors within retail that you're seeing are particularly interesting for BNPL or for Zip particularly?
Yeah. For Zip in particular, going back to this underestimated consumer, really it's about meeting them where they're at, and where they're at usually is like bridging day-to-day needs, and that can include things like groceries, bill pay, and I think the traditional way to think about, or the traditional way finance is thought about this, is through a kind of a pretty high judgment point of view. Is like, oh my gosh, you're using credit for groceries. Well, you look at what, I don't know, I use my Amex card for groceries. The 30-day float gives me a lot of optionality to figure out where and what I want to use cash on, and vice versa. I think that's what we're seeing a lot of the BNPL usage around as well, is that float is creating a lot of flexibility for this paycheck to paycheck consumer to manage their money in the way they want. And I think really it's the way they want. I wanted to emphasize I think traditionally you think of even budgeting. It's like, hey, strip out coffee from your budget. Well, if coffee's where you really find, a respite in your life, cutting out coffee is an unsustainable budgetary cut. And I think what we want to strive for is continuing to meet this consumer wherever they're at in their financial journey, provide access to easy, simple, flexible credit in a way that doesn't get them trapped on a debt treadmill. And I think that simplicity kind of shows up in the way the product works.
You talked about, Joe, that it's early days for BNPL in the U.S. compared especially to more mature economies like Australia. I know when Larry, the founder and previous CEO of Zip was on the show, he said it was the early innings as well. I'm kind of curious where you see the next wave of customers coming from. If this 2% of all transactions is, are early adopters, who's next coming online and what will it take to get them as customers for Zip?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think any of us know exactly where. I think you look at our customer base, largely in between, call it, 25 and 34. So we're not talking, the super young crowd, and we're not talking about, the older crowd either yet. But I think what we're seeing is familiarity and understanding of the product really emerge over these last couple of years. So when I think about, this group of consumers, call it 100 plus million, that are really frustrated with the financial system as it sits today, the judgment that it's associated with it. You make a mistake and FICO will haunt you for 7 years. Like you're starting to see that show up not only in our customer base, but in the younger crowd coming up into the system. There's a fear of like a credit card and how I can get potentially trapped. So when I think about this kind of broader trend of wanting to be out of debt, stay out of debt, BNPL offers a lot of the flexibility without the complexity. And so I think we'll continue to see an emergence kind of across all segments as kind of the stigma has eroded around what BNPL is and how it's used. And I think you can see that in a lot of the recent studies that have been released around just like how people are using BNPL, the payback behavior in particular. The average loan for us, we get 98% plus payback. If you contrasted that with a similar like for like at a credit card, you're only in the 90s. So that simplicity and trust that's being built, I think is kind of the bridge from that, pretty high delinquency rate to where Zip performs.
And I guess alongside the growth in usage is attention, particularly from regulators. And I'm kind of curious how you're positioning Zip in case there's more scrutiny around the industry.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of patterns in the world, right? I think if you look at the way buy now, pay later kind of grew up in Australia in particular, Zip's always been at the forefront of kind of regulatory fit for purpose for the consumer. We've always been consumer centric, which means like we want to take a mindset of anticipating what regulation could or should look like. And I think we've done that here in the US as well. I think always keeping the consumer's best interest at heart allows you to really structure your product and your services in a highly compliant way. We here in the US use a bank partnership and have for quite some time. WebBank's a terrific partner for us. And I think that puts us on a pretty clean regulatory positioning.
Got it. I'm kind of curious as well as you start to think about the next 3 to 5 years. What you talked about your background growing up in Flint and sort of the ethos that you bring to running the company and serving your customers. I'm curious where you think the firm will go in the next 3 to 5 years. Like what's your vision for that?
Yeah. Look, I think the world of fintech, and again, this will be a little soapboxy, but I think the world of fintech largely has been taking offline products and putting them online. Like that was early days. It felt transformational, I think, for a lot of us in those early days. But I think as we evolve, it's now more trying to think through like what those consumer experiences are really going to look like, what the merchants are going to need. And I think the large part for me is I think we're going to continue to just double down on our consumer base. It's an underestimated population that I think is largely ignored and or judged pretty quickly from like the FICO system. So what I mean by that is like I always kind of tell the story of this paycheck to paycheck consumer largely lives in the moment. They're probably better with where every dollar's going than any of us are. And I think trying to meet them and understand their cash flow needs and the lumpiness is really where Zip, I think, plays a role. And we're doing that already with our buy now, pay later product. I think we'll do a lot better as we move into a pay and Z structure, which allows us to customize not only the payment structure, but better align with the lumpiness of the consumer's paycheck. So I think the biggest thing for us to do is to continue to better understand the cash flow dynamics of the consumer. I think that one makes our underwriting stronger, but I think it better positions us where the consumers aren't paying late fees, or not paying payment date change fees. They're really just focused on us meeting them in the moment with the right product that puts them in the best chance to be successful. So to me, that cash flow data is an area where I think we'll continue to invest in our consumer.
Is the mirror side of that of getting more and more data also being able to provide the consumer with more visibility, I guess, in terms of the lumpiness? I think that's one of the challenges of managing that, right?
Yeah, that's a good clarification. So when you think about the lumpiness and living kind of in the moment, like you don't really anticipate things, right? So like think about getting a flat tire. You get a flat tire, your immediate decision is like, do I deploy cash on that flat tire to repair it, or do I because I got groceries this week, but I'm not thinking about the fact that I probably have a $200 heat bill in 2 months, or in 2 weeks. I probably have rent due in 3 weeks, and really trying to better match like the optimization of how I'm leveraging my cash, how I'm leveraging credit. Really, that's where I think we can play a stronger role, is like meet the consumer in that moment of distress, potentially distress or opportunity. Both are great, and provide them with the option set to maximize the moment. And I think that's really a different path of how traditional finances continue to work. I think, I grew up in traditional finance. It's always a retrospect. I want to provide some of that foresight, and allow people to optimize in this is probably back to my earlier days, but we know via some academically rigorous studies that you can reduce stress in somebody's life if you can help them really anticipate and manage those both expected and unexpected. So when I think of the future vision for Zip, it's really helping bring down kind of the stress, anxiety, and judgment that's associated with traditional finance, and provide the right access at the right moment.
We're getting near the end of our conversation, Joe, and I'd like to ask the question typically at the end, like if you have any personal, like big, hairy, audacious goals for this year.
Oh gosh,
personal, professional. You can meet that in the moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I shifted this year to starting to read a lot more. I got 2 young kids, so like a lot of this is just like, how do you stay sane? And find time for professional. I think where I look at my big, hairy, audacious goal is really around what I perceive as the opportunity for Zip. I talk to the company about this all the time. Like there's a moment here where we've got an opportunity to really make an impact. And I think the biggest, you look at this consumer base of, call it, 100 plus million, we serve just over 4 million of that today. So for us to have really significant growth opportunity here in the US means mostly that we need to stay focused and we need to execute. And it's not the sexiest of goals, for sure.
Not a hair on that one. Yeah.
No, but when I think about, and I don't want to signal too strong to any investors, but when I think about the potential of this company, I just haven't seen too many opportunities where the macro is there, the business, the culture of the company are all lined up in the right way, and really it just depends on focus, and I think that's where my head's at professionally. Personally, balancing that giant opportunity with being a good dad and a good husband that's probably the hairy part of it.
I hear that, man. Joe, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for joining us on the Tearsheet Podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.